In the mountains of North Carolina stands a house so large, so ambitious, that no one has ever built anything like it again. This isn't just the biggest private home in America. It's the last time someone tried to live like European royalty, on American soil. Behind these walls are stories of extreme wealth, hidden modern technology, and a bold experiment that reshaped how America thought about land, luxury, and power. This is the Biltmore Estate, and the story behind it is far more interesting than its size. The Biltmore Estate holds a record that has never been broken, and almost certainly never will be. At nearly 179,000 square feet, it remains the largest private home ever constructed in the United States. Not the largest historic home. Not the largest surviving home. The largest, period. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what private home meant in the late 19th century. Biltmore was not a hotel, a government building, or a ceremonial palace. It was designed to be lived in by one family. Every hallway, bedroom, fireplace, and service corridor existed to support the daily rhythm of private life, just on a scale no American had ever attempted before. The sheer numbers are staggering. Around 250 rooms, including 35 bedrooms and 43 bathrooms. A banquet hall tall enough to rival European castles. Long interior corridors designed not for grandeur, but to quietly move staff, supplies, and heat through the building without disturbing the owners. Even today, walking through Biltmore feels less like touring a mansion and more like navigating a small, self-contained world. What makes this record remarkable is not just that it was achieved, but when. Biltmore was completed in 1895, decades before modern construction equipment, standardized steel framing, or digital planning. Every stone was quarried, shaped, and set by hand. Thousands of craftsmen, laborers, and artisans worked for years to assemble something that, at the time, had no American precedent. And yet, despite over a century of exploding wealth in the United States, industrial titans, oil magnates, tech billionaires, no one has tried to top it. Modern wealth tends to fragment into multiple properties: penthouses, compounds, islands, yachts. Biltmore represents a moment when wealth was concentrated not just in money, but in place. One vision, one site, one extraordinary gamble. That gamble came with consequences. The size that made Biltmore legendary also made it nearly impossible to sustain as a traditional home. Heating, staffing, and maintaining such a structure required an army of workers and an enormous fortune. In many ways, Biltmore's scale ensured that it could only exist for a brief window in American history, before income tax, before labor reform, before the modern cost of complexity caught up. Today, the title of largest private home is less a bragging right and more a historical marker. It tells us that Biltmore was not just built big. It was built at the absolute limit of what private ambition could achieve in America. And once that limit was reached, the country quietly decided never to cross it again. The Biltmore Estate was not built just to be large. It was built to feel old, intentionally old. George Vanderbilt wanted something rare in America at the end of the 19th century, the sense of inherited culture that European aristocracy had spent centuries accumulating. In Europe, great estates were not simply houses. They were symbols of lineage, land stewardship, and intellectual life. They implied continuity, families rooted to a place for generations. America, by contrast, was young, fast, and restless. Wealth appeared suddenly, often within a single lifetime. What Vanderbilt attempted at Biltmore was nothing less than compressing centuries of European tradition into one bold American experiment. Architect Richard Morris Hunt modeled the house after French Renaissance chateaux, particularly those in the Loire Valley. This was not accidental. French chateaux were not primarily royal palaces. They were country estates for nobles, places of learning, hunting, art, and retreat. Biltmore's towers, steep roofs, carved stonework, and monumental symmetry all speak the architectural language of European nobility rather than American industrial wealth. But architecture alone was not enough. Vanderbilt filled the house with tapestries, original artworks, antique furniture, and one of the most serious private libraries in the country. He spoke multiple languages, traveled extensively, and saw himself not as a tycoon but as a custodian of culture. Biltmore was meant to signal refinement, not dominance. What makes this attempt fascinating is how quietly it failed. European aristocracy was sustained by systems America did not have: titles, tenant land, inherited political power. In the United States, wealth could buy beauty and scale, but it could not buy permanence. Within a single generation, the cost of maintaining such an estate began to outweigh its symbolic value. The social world that made estates like this meaningful simply did not exist here. Biltmore therefore stands as a kind of architectural what-if. What if America had developed a landed aristocracy? What if wealth had stayed rooted to place instead of flowing toward mobility and reinvention? The house answers those questions not with theory, but with stone and silence. After George Vanderbilt's death, the estate shifted away from private aristocratic life and toward public access. That transition marks the end of the dream Biltmore represented. The house remains, but the idea behind it, an American nobility modeled on Europe, quietly faded away. Biltmore is impressive because it shows how far wealth could go. It's important because it shows where it stopped. Biltmore is often described as George Vanderbilt's dream, but the reality is more complex and more interesting. The estate is the product of a rare collaboration between three powerful minds: a patron with immense resources, an architect capable of translating European grandeur into an American context, and A.C., landscape designer who fundamentally changed how the United States understood nature. Without any one of them, Biltmore would not exist in the form we know today. Richard Morris Hunt was the obvious choice to design the house. By the late 19th century, he was America's most prestigious architect, trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and deeply fluent in European architectural language. Hunt did not merely imitate French Renaissance architecture. He understood its underlying logic, how space, symmetry, and ornament conveyed hierarchy and purpose. For Biltmore, he designed a structure that feels ancient yet controlled, monumental yet livable. One of Hunt's greatest achievements at Biltmore is how he balanced scale with intimacy. Despite the building's massive footprint, individual rooms were designed to feel human in proportion. Private spaces, like bedrooms and studies, were deliberately separated from ceremonial areas like the banquet hall and the grand stair. Hidden corridors, service staircases, and internal logistics systems allowed the house to function smoothly without disrupting the illusion of effortless aristocratic life. Equally important was Hunt's embrace of modern engineering. Beneath the limestone exterior lies a steel framework, cutting-edge technology at the time. This allowed for taller ceilings, larger rooms, and more ambitious structural spans than traditional masonry alone would permit. Biltmore may look medieval, but it is, in many ways, a thoroughly modern building wearing historic clothing. If Hunt gave Biltmore its body, Frederick Law Olmsted gave it its soul. Olmsted is best known today as the designer of Central Park, but his work at Biltmore was arguably more influential. Vanderbilt did not want formal gardens stretching endlessly from the house. He wanted the illusion of untouched wilderness, rolling hills, distant forests, and long, carefully framed views. Olmsted understood that natural landscapes are often the most artificial of all. When Olmsted first saw the land that would become Biltmore, much of it was badly degraded. Logging and poor farming practices had stripped the soil and scarred the hillsides. What Olmsted proposed was radical, not simply landscaping but rehabilitation. He reshaped the terrain, replanted vast areas, and designed a sequence of visual experiences that guided visitors gradually from cultivated gardens to managed forest to what felt like open countryside. This approach did more than beautify the estate. It laid the groundwork for modern American forestry. Olmsted believed land should be productive, sustainable, and beautiful all at once. Under his guidance, Biltmore became the first large-scale experiment in scientific forest management in the United States, a model that would later influence national parks and federal forest policy. The brilliance of Biltmore lies in how architecture and landscape speak to each other. The house does not dominate the land, it emerges from it. Long approach roads conceal the mansion until the final moment, heightening drama. Views from the windows are not random. They are composed like paintings, with hills and forests acting as living frames. This collaboration between Hunt and Olmsted created something uniquely American. European estates evolved over centuries. Biltmore had to be invented all at once. That it feels coherent rather than forced is a testament to the discipline and vision of the men who designed it. Biltmore endures not just because it is large or expensive, but because it was intelligently imagined by people who understood that true grandeur is not only built, but carefully staged, managed, and sustained. At first glance, Biltmore appears to be a celebration of the past. Stone walls, carved ornament, towering chimneys, and the unmistakable silhouette of a French Renaissance chateau. But this historic appearance hides one of the most technologically advanced private residences of the 19th century. In reality, Biltmore was less a medieval fantasy and more a prototype of the modern luxury home, built decades before such comforts became common. When the estate was completed in 1895, electricity itself was still a novelty. Many American cities had limited or unreliable electrical grids, and rural areas often had none at all. Biltmore, however, was fully electrified from the beginning. Light fixtures were designed to resemble candles and gas lamps, not because electricity was inferior, but because it was unfamiliar. Vanderbilt wanted the benefits of modern power, without disturbing the visual language of the past. The electrical system at Biltmore was privately generated and meticulously planned. Wiring was concealed within walls and ceilings, and the placement of switches was carefully considered to maintain aesthetic harmony. This attention to detail allowed the house to feel timeless rather than experimental, a critical distinction for a residence meant to evoke permanence and tradition. Plumbing was equally advanced. Biltmore featured indoor bathrooms with running hot and cold water, an astonishing luxury at the time. While many wealthy households still relied on chamber pots and servants to manage sanitation, Biltmore embraced modern hygiene. Its plumbing infrastructure included multiple boilers, pressurized water systems, and a layout designed to handle simultaneous use across the massive building. This was not just convenience. It was a fundamental shift in how domestic life could function. Heating a structure of this size posed an enormous challenge. Instead of relying solely on fireplaces, Biltmore used a central heating system that distributed warm air throughout the house. Fireplaces remained, but more for ambiance than necessity. This allowed rooms to be used comfortably year-round, regardless of weather, and reduced the labor required to keep the house habitable. One of the most remarkable features of Biltmore is its early approach to food storage and preparation. The estate included a refrigerated room, long before household refrigerators existed, using mechanical cooling to preserve food. This allowed for sophisticated meal planning, reduced waste, and a level of culinary refinement that mirrored the great houses of Europe. The kitchens were industrial in scale, equipped to serve large dinners while remaining invisible to guests. The house also included a call bell system connecting rooms to servant areas, elevators for both people and goods, and carefully separated circulation paths that allowed staff to move efficiently, without crossing into formal spaces. These systems were designed not for spectacle, but for smooth operation. Luxury at Biltmore was defined as effortlessness. Perhaps most impressive is how seamlessly this technology was integrated. Unlike many early modern buildings that proudly displayed their innovations, Biltmore hid them. The machinery, pipes, and wiring were meant to disappear. Vanderbilt understood that true sophistication lies in what you don't notice. This forward-thinking design helps explain why Biltmore aged more gracefully than many of its contemporaries. While other Gilded Age mansions became obsolete as standards of comfort changed, Biltmore had already anticipated the future. Its creators were not just building a grand house, they were quietly redefining what a modern home could be. For all its grandeur and elegance, Biltmore was never meant to function as a solitary monument. It was a living, working environment sustained by an extensive and largely unseen workforce. The smooth, effortless luxury experienced by guests depended on hundreds of individuals whose daily lives unfolded far from the public rooms and grand views. At its peak, Biltmore employed several hundred staff members, forming what was essentially a self-contained service community. This included housemaids, valets, footmen, cooks, laundresses, gardeners, engineers, stable hands, and administrators. Each role was carefully defined, and each worker understood their place within a rigid hierarchy designed to keep the estate operating with clockwork precision. The architecture itself reveals how central servants were to the life of the house. Hidden staircases, narrow corridors, and discreet doors allowed staff to move invisibly through the building. Meals could be prepared, rooms cleaned, fires maintained, and guests attended to, without disturbing the illusion of quiet refinement. In many ways, the servant infrastructure was just as complex as the visible rooms, only more efficient. Living conditions for staff varied widely. Senior servants, such as butlers and housekeepers, often enjoyed private rooms and higher status. Junior staff, especially young women employed as maids, lived in shared quarters with long working hours and little privacy. Days were structured around bells and schedules, with duties beginning early and extending late into the evening. Time off was limited and expectations were high. Despite the demanding nature of the work, employment at Biltmore carried a certain prestige. The estate offered steady wages, housing, and a degree of security uncommon in rural Appalachia at the time. Many employees remained for years, even generations, developing deep ties to the property and its routines. Biltmore was not just a workplace, it was a world. Beyond the house itself, the broader estate required an additional layer of labor. Farmers, foresters, craftsmen, and maintenance crews worked the land, managed livestock, maintained roads, and oversaw forestry operations. This network of labor transformed Biltmore into a functioning economic ecosystem rather than a passive display of wealth. The scale of staffing also highlights a crucial truth about Gilded Age luxury. It was labor-intensive by design. Comfort was not automated, it was human. Warm rooms required fires to be lit. Clean spaces required constant attention. Elegant meals required hours of preparation and coordination. The beauty of Biltmore was inseparable from the effort that sustained it. As the 20th century progressed, this model became increasingly difficult to maintain. Rising labor costs, social change, and new expectations of privacy and independence made large servant staffs impractical. Biltmore's transition from private home to public destination reflects this shift. The estate could no longer function as it once had, not because it failed, but because the world around it changed. Today, the hidden corridors and servant staircases stand as quiet reminders of the people who made Biltmore possible. Their stories rarely appear in portraits or guidebooks, yet without them, the estate would never have lived, breathed, or endured. One of the most important and least expected legacies of the Biltmore Estate has nothing to do with architecture, luxury, or social life. It lies in the forests that surround the house. Long before environmental conservation became a national concern, Biltmore quietly became the birthplace of modern American forestry. When George Vanderbilt began acquiring land in western North Carolina, much of it was already damaged. Decades of aggressive logging, poor farming practices, and erosion had stripped hillsides bare and exhausted the soil. To many landowners of the era, this land was expendable, something to extract value from and abandon. Vanderbilt, however, saw the estate as a long-term experiment, not a short-term profit engine. To realize that vision, he did something unprecedented in the United States. He hired a professionally trained forester. At the time, forestry as a scientific discipline barely existed in America. European nations, particularly Germany and France, had been managing forests sustainably for generations, but the U.S. still treated forests as limitless resources. Vanderbilt wanted something different. Under this program, trees were not simply harvested, they were studied. Different species were planted and tracked. Growth cycles were measured. Selective cutting replaced clear cutting. Roads and drainage systems were designed to reduce erosion. The goal was balance. Economic productivity without ecological collapse. This approach transformed the estate into a living laboratory. Over time, damaged land recovered. Forests became healthier and more diverse. Wildlife returned. What looked like untouched wilderness was, in reality, carefully planned and continuously managed. The illusion of nature was supported by rigorous science. The influence of this work extended far beyond Biltmore's boundaries. Forestry students trained on the estate went on to shape state and federal land management programs. The principles tested here helped inspire the creation of the U.S. Forest Service and informed early conservation policy. In a quiet but profound way, Biltmore helped teach America how to think long-term about land. Frederick Law Olmsted's earlier involvement amplified this impact. His belief that landscapes should be both beautiful and useful aligned perfectly with forestry science. Together, design and data reinforced each other. The forest was not just scenery, it was infrastructure. What makes this legacy especially striking is how unexpected it was. Biltmore is often criticized as a symbol of excess, yet its most enduring contribution was restraint. Instead of consuming land, it preserved it. Instead of extracting until depletion, it planned for continuity. Today, when visitors drive through the estate's long, winding approach roads, they are passing through one of the earliest examples of sustainable land management in the country. The forests feel timeless, but they are the result of deliberate choices made more than a century ago. In this way, Biltmore challenges a common assumption about the Gilded Age, that wealth only destroyed. In at least this one case, extraordinary resources were used not just to build something grand, but to repair and protect something fragile. The mansion may be what draws the eye, but the forest is what changed the nation. Biltmore was never intended to be just a large residence surrounded by decorative land. From the beginning, George Vanderbilt envisioned it as a fully functioning estate, a place capable of sustaining itself economically, agriculturally, and logistically. In this sense, Biltmore was less like a mansion and more like a small, carefully managed kingdom. At its height, the estate encompassed approximately 125,000 acres. This vast expanse included forests, farmland, dairies, greenhouses, workshops, and entire villages built to house workers and their families. Roads, water systems, and rail connections were developed internally, allowing the estate to operate with remarkable independence from the outside world. Agriculture played a central role in this vision. Biltmore's farms produced vegetables, fruits, meat, and dairy products for the household and staff. The estate dairy was especially advanced, incorporating modern sanitation and breeding practices to ensure high-quality milk and butter. These operations were not improvised. They were designed using the latest agricultural science available at the time. Greenhouses supplied flowers and fresh produce year-round, while experimental crops were tested to determine what could thrive in the Appalachian climate. Successes were expanded, failures studied. This scientific approach mirrored what was happening in the forests and reinforced the idea that the estate was an evolving system rather than a static display of wealth. Industrial facilities supported daily operations. Blacksmith shops, carpentry workshops, and machine rooms repaired tools, vehicles, and infrastructure. The estate even had its own brickworks and sawmills, reducing reliance on external suppliers. Nothing about Biltmore was accidental. Redundancy and self-reliance were built into its structure. Socially, the estate functioned as a layered community. Managers and skilled workers occupied positions of authority, while laborers and service staff filled essential roles. Schools, churches, and stores existed nearby, creating a social fabric that extended beyond the mansion walls. For many residents, Biltmore was not just an employer, it was home. This model reflected Vanderbilt's admiration for European landed estates, where wealth was tied to land stewardship and productivity, rather than speculation alone. In America, such estates were rare and often short-lived. Biltmore came closer than most to realizing that ideal, at least temporarily. However, the same scale that made self-sufficiency possible also made it fragile. Maintaining such an extensive operation required constant investment and oversight. As economic conditions changed and labor became more expensive, the estate's model became increasingly difficult to sustain. Gradually, land was sold, operations scaled back, and the vision adjusted to new realities. What remains today is a refined version of that original concept. While the estate is no longer fully self-sufficient, echoes of its original design persist in its agricultural programs, winery, and land management practices. The idea of Biltmore as a living system rather than a frozen artifact, continues to shape how it operates. Understanding Biltmore as an estate rather than simply a house reveals its true ambition. It was not built merely to be admired. It was built to function, endure, and justify its own existence. That it came as close as it did is one of the most remarkable aspects of its story. The banquet hall at Biltmore is not simply the largest room in the house, it is the most symbolic. With its soaring 70-foot ceiling, massive stone fireplace, and walls lined with Flemish tapestries, the space was designed to overwhelm. From the moment a guest stepped inside, the message was clear. This was a house that understood power, history, and theatrical presence. In European castles and great houses, the Great Hall was the center of social life. It was where feasts were held, alliances forged, and hierarchy displayed. By recreating this space at Biltmore, George Vanderbilt and architect Richard Morris Hunt were making a deliberate statement. This was not a modern American dining room scaled up. It was an explicit reference to medieval and Renaissance traditions of authority. The scale of the room is its first impact. The ceiling rises higher than many church naves, supported visually by carved stone details that draw the eye upward. The fireplace, large enough to stand inside, anchors the space and serves as a reminder of an era when warmth, hospitality, and dominance were all expressed through fire. Above it hangs a portrait of George Washington, subtly linking European tradition to American legitimacy. Tapestries imported from Europe line the walls, serving both decorative and acoustic purposes. In medieval halls, tapestries insulated against cold and damp, while displaying wealth and narrative. At Biltmore, they perform the same dual function, softening the vast space while reinforcing its old-world character. Every surface in the room was chosen not just for beauty, but for meaning. Yet the banquet hall was used far less frequently than its grandeur suggests. George Vanderbilt was not known for hosting constant lavish feasts. When dinners were held here, they were carefully staged events rather than routine occurrences. Long tables, formal service, and candlelight combined to create an atmosphere that felt ceremonial rather than casual. Behind the scenes, the logistics of serving this room were extraordinary. Food traveled from distant kitchens through hidden corridors and elevators. Staff had to coordinate timing precisely to maintain the illusion of effortless abundance. The hall's drama depended entirely on invisible systems and disciplined labor. What makes the banquet hall especially interesting is its dual nature. It is both authentic and artificial. Authentic in its materials, craftsmanship, and historical references. Artificial in the sense that it was built for a social world that no longer truly existed. By the time Biltmore was completed, the age of feudal hierarchy was long gone. The hall was a revival, a performance of tradition rather than a continuation of it. In this way, the banquet hall encapsulates the central tension of Biltmore itself. It is magnificent, convincing, and slightly out of time. It asks visitors not just to admire its scale, but to consider why such a space was built at all. Standing in the hall today, one does not simply see a room. One feels the ambition to make power visible, history tangible, and authority architectural. That ambition may no longer govern American life, but here, it still echoes. Hidden beneath the grandeur and formality of Biltmore's public rooms lies a surprisingly modern vision of leisure. Long before fitness culture, wellness trends, or recreational amenities became standard features of luxury homes, Biltmore incorporated spaces dedicated entirely to physical well-being and private enjoyment. These rooms reveal a side of the estate that feels unexpectedly contemporary. One of the most striking examples is the indoor swimming pool. Measuring approximately 65 feet long, the pool was a marvel of late 19th century engineering. It was fed by fresh water, drained regularly, and illuminated by underwater lighting, an astonishing feature at a time when most people had never seen electric light at all, let alone beneath the surface of water. The blue-green ceramic tiles, simple yet elegant, emphasized cleanliness and function over decoration. Swimming at Biltmore was not about spectacle. The pool was tucked away from public view, reserved for private use. This reflects a broader truth about the estate. Many of its most advanced and luxurious features were not meant to be seen. They were meant to be experienced quietly. reinforcing the idea that true privilege does not need to announce itself. Nearby, the gymnasium further challenges modern assumptions about Gilded Age lifestyles. Far from being idle or indulgent, elite households increasingly viewed physical fitness as part of intellectual and moral discipline. The gym at Biltmore was equipped with early exercise devices, including pulleys, weights, and stretching equipment designed to improve strength, posture, and overall health. These machines may look primitive today, but at the time they represented cutting-edge thinking about the human body. The presence of these facilities suggests that George Vanderbilt embraced a holistic view of life. Leisure was not simply relaxation, it was cultivation. Physical exercise, like reading or travel, was part of becoming a well-rounded individual. In this sense, Biltmore's leisure spaces align more closely with European aristocratic ideals than with American notions of conspicuous consumption. Beyond formal exercise, the estate offered numerous opportunities for recreation. Extensive grounds supported horseback riding, walking, and outdoor sports. The surrounding forests and fields were designed not only to be productive, but to invite exploration. The boundary between work, leisure, and landscape was intentionally blurred. These amenities also served a practical purpose. Biltmore was isolated, and travel in the late 19th century was slow and demanding. By providing varied forms of entertainment and activity on site, the estate ensured that guests could remain for extended stays without monotony. The house was designed to hold attention as well as shelter. What makes these spaces particularly compelling is how little they conform to stereotypes of Gilded Age excess. There is no gold leaf, no ostentatious display. Instead, there is a quiet confidence in the belief that health, comfort, and pleasure were worthy investments. This restraint makes the luxury feel timeless rather than dated. Today, these rooms offer a glimpse into a private world rarely associated with historic mansions. They remind us that Biltmore was not just a place to be seen. It was a place to live, move, and recharge. In many ways, its approach to leisure anticipated modern ideas of balance and well-being by more than a century. Among Biltmore's many impressive spaces, the library stands apart, not because it is the largest room, but because it is the most revealing. Containing more than 10,000 volumes, the library offers a rare glimpse into the inner life of George Vanderbilt. While other rooms project power or hospitality, this one quietly signals something else: intellectual ambition. In an era when many wealthy Americans use libraries as decorative backdrops, Vanderbilt treated his as a working space. The collection was not assembled to impress visitors, but to be read. Books in multiple languages line the shelves, reflecting his fluency in French and interest in European literature, philosophy, history, and science. This was a private archive of curiosity, rather than a public statement of prestige. Architecturally, the library is intimate compared to the banquet hall or grand staircase. Warm wood paneling, comfortable seating, and carefully controlled lighting create an atmosphere conducive to long hours of reading. The design encourages focus rather than awe. It is a room meant to hold attention, not command it. Technological innovation again plays a quiet role. The library was among the first rooms in the house to be electrified, ensuring consistent light for reading at all hours. Fireplaces provided warmth, while thick walls and heavy doors helped insulate against noise. Every element served a purpose tied to concentration and comfort. The collection itself was carefully curated. Vanderbilt collected classics, contemporary works, scientific texts, travel accounts, and rare editions. He was particularly interested in books that expanded his understanding of the world beyond America. In this sense, the library functioned as an intellectual bridge between continents, mirroring the estate's architectural dialogue between Europe and the United States. What makes the library especially compelling is how it contrasts with common narratives of Gilded Age wealth. This is not a room built to dazzle. It does not overwhelm with scale or ornament. Instead, it suggests discipline, solitude, and sustained effort. Knowledge here is treated as a lifelong pursuit rather than a fashionable accessory. The library also reinforces the idea of Biltmore as a retreat. This was a place to withdraw from public life, to think rather than perform. While other rooms supported social rituals, the library supported private reflection. In many ways, it was the emotional center of the house. After Vanderbilt's death, the library remained largely intact, preserving a snapshot of his intellectual world. Walking through it today feels less like touring a historic room and more like stepping into a paused moment of thought. The books remain where they were left, as if their owner has only stepped away briefly. In a mansion defined by extremes of scale and ambition, the library offers a counterbalance. It reminds us that Biltmore was not built solely by wealth, but by curiosity. And that, perhaps more than stone or land, was the estate's most enduring foundation. Biltmore's elegance depended on a system that few visitors ever saw: its kitchens and food infrastructure. Hidden deep within the estate, these spaces reveal how thoroughly the house was designed to function as a modern organism. Feeding a household of this scale, owners, guests, and staff required precision, innovation, and industrial-level planning. The kitchens at Biltmore were vast, divided into specialized zones rather than a single workspace. Separate areas handled baking, roasting, pastry production, and food preparation. This division mirrored the structure of professional European kitchens, where efficiency and hierarchy governed every task. Nothing about food service was casual. Meals were the result of coordination, timing, and trained labor. One of the most advanced features of the estate was its early refrigeration system. Long before household refrigerators became common, Biltmore used mechanical cooling to preserve food. Cold storage rooms allowed meats, dairy, and produce to be kept fresh for extended periods, reducing waste and enabling more complex menus. Ice houses and cooling technologies worked together to maintain stable temperatures year-round. This system changed how meals could be planned. Instead of relying solely on seasonal availability or daily deliveries, the estate could store ingredients strategically. This flexibility allowed for refined cuisine that matched European standards, even in the relative isolation of Western North Carolina. The scale of food service extended far beyond formal dinners. Daily meals for staff had to be prepared efficiently, consistently, and in large quantities. This required careful logistics and a reliable supply chain. Estate farms, dairies, and gardens fed directly into the kitchen system, reinforcing Biltmore's self-sustaining model. Sanitation was a priority. At a time when foodborne illness was poorly understood, Biltmore implemented modern cleanliness standards. Surfaces were designed to be washed easily, waste was managed systematically, and airflow was controlled to reduce heat and odors. These practices reflected an emerging scientific understanding of health and hygiene. The physical separation between kitchens and dining spaces was intentional. Food traveled through service corridors, elevators, and warming rooms to ensure it arrived at the correct temperature and moment. Guests experienced seamless service, unaware of the complexity behind it. This invisibility was itself a luxury. What makes Biltmore's food system particularly impressive is how forward-looking it was. Many of its principles, zoned kitchens, cold storage, sanitation protocols, are now standard in professional culinary environments. At the time, they were rare in private homes. These spaces also humanize the estate. While grand rooms speak of ideals and ambition, the kitchens speak of daily life. They remind us that behind every formal dinner was a team of workers applying skill, discipline, and knowledge to an enormous task. In understanding how Biltmore was fed, we better understand how it lived. The estate was not sustained by spectacle alone, but by systems, quiet, complex, and essential. Many grand American estates did not survive the 20th century. Crushed by maintenance costs, taxes, and changing social values, they were abandoned, demolished, or sold piece by piece. Biltmore avoided that fate, not by resisting change, but by embracing it earlier and more strategically than almost any of its peers. George Vanderbilt's death in 1914 marked a turning point. Without his personal fortune and vision, the estate's original model became increasingly difficult to sustain. The sheer cost of maintaining the house, land, and workforce was staggering. Heating alone consumed vast resources, and the social world that justified such an estate was rapidly disappearing. Rather than allowing Biltmore to decline, the Vanderbilt family made a crucial decision. They opened the house to the public. This move was unconventional at the time. Private homes of this scale were rarely shared. and the idea of turning a personal residence into a tourist destination carried social stigma. Yet it proved to be visionary. Public access transformed Biltmore from a financial liability into a cultural asset. Admission fees provided revenue for maintenance, while the house's scale and beauty ensured enduring public interest. Visitors were not just touring rooms. They were stepping into a preserved moment of American history. The estate itself also evolved. Large portions of land were sold or transferred to public use, including areas that would later become part of national forest systems. What remained was managed more efficiently, with a focus on sustainability rather than expansion. This downsizing was not failure, it was adaptation. Over time, Biltmore diversified its operations. Agricultural programs continued, and eventually a winery was introduced, aligning with the estate's historic emphasis on land productivity. These ventures generated income while reinforcing the estate's identity as a living landscape rather than a static museum. Crucially, Biltmore remained in family hands. While ownership passed through generations, the guiding philosophy endured: preservation through use. Unlike estates frozen in time and detached from modern life, Biltmore was allowed to evolve. Infrastructure was updated, conservation standards improved, and visitor experiences expanded. This balance between access and authenticity is delicate. Too much commercialization risks diluting historical meaning. Too little risks financial collapse. Biltmore's success lies in navigating this tension carefully. The estate invites millions of visitors each year, without erasing the character that made it worth preserving in the first place. Today, Biltmore stands as both an artifact and an institution. It is a home that became a landmark, a private dream that found public purpose. Its survival is not accidental. It is the result of difficult decisions made at the right time. In this sense, Biltmore's most impressive achievement may not be what was built in stone, but what was preserved through adaptation. The estate did not survive by clinging to the past. It survived by learning how to live in the future. To understand Biltmore fully, one must look beyond the mansion itself and grasp the astonishing scale of the land that once surrounded it. At its peak, the Biltmore Estate encompassed approximately 125,000 acres, an expanse so large it functioned less like a property and more like a region. This scale was not incidental. It was essential to George Vanderbilt's vision. In the late 19th century, land equaled power. European aristocracies derived their influence not from cash alone, but from vast holdings that produced food, timber, and rent over generations. Vanderbilt sought to replicate this model in America, where land was abundant, but stewardship was often short-term and extractive. Biltmore's acreage was meant to anchor wealth to place. The estate's land was diverse. Dense forests covered the hills, while valleys supported agriculture and livestock. Rivers and streams provided water and transportation routes. Entire villages existed within the estate boundaries, housing workers, managers, and their families. Roads, bridges, and rail connections were built internally, reinforcing Biltmore's autonomy. Managing such a domain required structure. The estate was divided into operational zones: forestry, farming, residential, and industrial. Each zone had its own staff, systems, and goals, coordinated under a centralized administration. This was not a passive holding, it was a working landscape. Forestry operations, in particular, defined much of the land's use. Timber was harvested selectively and sustainably, providing income while maintaining long-term ecological health. This approach contrasted sharply with the widespread clear-cutting that characterized the era. Biltmore's forests were treated as renewable assets rather than expendable resources. Agricultural areas supplied food for the estate and supported experimental farming practices. Soil improvement, crop rotation, and livestock breeding were all studied and refined. These efforts reflected Vanderbilt's belief that land should improve under human care, not degrade. The sheer size of the estate also shaped daily life. Travel within Biltmore could take hours. Decisions about road placement, sightlines, and access points affected how people experienced space and distance. The famous long approach to the mansion was not just theatrical. It was a psychological transition from public world to private domain. Over time, this scale proved unsustainable in its original form. Economic pressures, taxes, and changing land values forced a gradual reduction of the estate. Large portions were sold or donated, eventually forming parts of public forests and parks. What remained was still vast, but no longer imperial in scope. This contraction, however, does not diminish the significance of what once existed. Understanding Biltmore's original size reframes the mansion itself. The house was not an isolated extravagance. It was the symbolic center of an enormous, carefully managed landscape. Today, visitors see a fraction of what Biltmore once controlled. Yet the logic of scale remains visible in the sweeping views, long drives, and sense of distance that still define the estate. Biltmore was built to command space, and even in reduction, it continues to do so. The American landscape is scattered with the ghosts of grand estates that once rivaled Biltmore in ambition, if not in size. Many of the great Gilded Age mansions, especially those built in New York, Newport, and along the East Coast, didn't survive intact. Some were demolished, others abandoned, and many were broken apart or converted beyond recognition. Biltmore's survival, therefore, demands explanation. The first reason is timing. Biltmore was completed at the very end of the Gilded Age, just before structural forces began to shift American society. Income tax, labor reform, and changing attitudes toward wealth were already on the horizon. While earlier mansions were designed for a social system that collapsed rapidly, Biltmore entered a world already beginning to adapt. This gave it a narrow but crucial window to evolve. The second reason is purpose. Many Gilded Age mansions were built primarily for social performance. Seasonal displays of wealth meant to impress peers. When those social rituals faded, the houses lost their reason to exist. Biltmore, by contrast, was conceived as a retreat and an estate. It was tied to land, productivity, and long-term stewardship. Even when its social role diminished, its functional logic remained. Scale also played a paradoxical role. While Biltmore's size made it expensive to maintain, it also made it unique. Smaller mansions could be replaced, subdivided, or ignored. Biltmore was too singular to be easily dismissed. Its unmatched scale transformed it from a private liability into a public curiosity, and eventually, a cultural landmark. Equally important was ownership continuity. Many estates passed through multiple hands, each less willing to shoulder preservation costs. Biltmore remained within the Vanderbilt family, allowing decisions to be guided by legacy rather than short-term profit. This continuity enabled long-range thinking and strategic compromise. Opening the house to the public was the decisive move. While other families resisted exposure and clung to privacy until finances collapsed, Biltmore embraced tourism early. This reframed the estate's value. It was no longer justified by private use alone, but by public interest, education, and heritage. Geography also mattered. Biltmore's rural setting insulated it from development pressure. Urban mansions sat on extremely valuable land, making demolition financially attractive. Biltmore's land, by contrast, was integral to its identity. Selling the house without the landscape would have destroyed its meaning and its appeal. Finally, Biltmore benefited from narrative. It was not just preserved, it was explained. Visitors were invited to understand its history, systems, and contradictions. This storytelling transformed the estate from an outdated symbol of excess into a lens through which to examine American ambition. Biltmore survived because it changed roles. It stopped being just a home and became a reference point, a place where architecture, land, wealth, and history intersect. While other mansions tried to remain what they were, Biltmore learned how to become something else. That ability to adapt is the quiet reason it still stands. Biltmore is often described as a triumph of wealth, vision, and craftsmanship. But in a deeper sense, it is also a monument to an ending. No private residence of this scale has ever been built in the United States since, and it is unlikely that one ever will be. Biltmore marks the outer limit of what private ambition could achieve in American society. When the house was completed in 1895, the conditions that made it possible were already fading. There was no federal income tax. Labor was abundant and inexpensive. Environmental regulation was minimal. Enormous fortunes could be concentrated in a single individual's hands with little restraint. Biltmore was built in that brief window, at the exact moment when everything aligned. Within a generation, that world disappeared. The early 20th century brought new political realities, new expectations of fairness, and new attitudes toward wealth. Large servant staffs became impractical. Private estates lost social legitimacy. Wealth no longer needed to be rooted in land to sustain power. It became mobile, abstract, and global. Biltmore therefore stands at a historical crossroads. It looks backward to European aristocratic traditions and forward to modern systems of technology, land management, and tourism. It is both an imitation of the past and a prototype of the future. Few places embody that tension so clearly. Today, visitors do not experience Biltmore as its creator intended. It is no longer a private retreat for quiet contemplation. It is a public space, carefully curated and widely shared. Yet this transformation does not diminish its meaning. In many ways, it completes it. The house was built to express a philosophy of stewardship and continuity, and those ideals now extend to a broader public. What makes Biltmore endure emotionally is not its luxury, but its clarity. It tells a complete story: the rise of extraordinary wealth, the attempt to give it cultural weight, and the inevitable reckoning that followed. Unlike many monuments that celebrate only success, Biltmore also reveals limits. It reminds us that architecture is never just about buildings. It reflects values, assumptions, and power structures. Biltmore shows us what happens when a young nation briefly believes it can import old-world permanence, and then discovers it must invent something new instead. In that sense, Biltmore is not frozen in the past. It is in conversation with the present. It asks what we build, why we build it, and what we expect it to say about us long after we are gone. That is why the Biltmore Estate still matters. As you've seen, the Biltmore Estate is more than a mansion. It's a record of ambition, imagination, and a moment in history that will never happen again. A place where architecture, land, technology, and ideas briefly aligned, and then the world moved on. Thank you for spending this time exploring it with us. If you enjoyed this journey through one of America's most extraordinary homes, let us know, and stay with us for more stories like this, where buildings aren't just structures, but windows into who we were and who we became. Until next time, thanks for watching.